Are we on, Mr. Bryant? All right, well, welcome to Tuesday night Theologetics, emphasizing the ologetics a little bit. We are in the new year, starting a new book, and you guys are here tonight. I just want to say, first of all, thank you for being here. It's a big night for me. There's a lot happening at the beginning of this year, and we're starting a new book tonight. So the book we're going to be going over is God's Undertaker by John Lennox. How many of you know the book, or who has the book? Anyone have it? No one has it. All right. It came out in 2007, so it's an older book, and I'm going to explain why we're doing that in a second. Let me just give you a couple announcements or whatever. I'll say a prayer, and we'll jump into it. I think this will be fun for us. So whereas the book we had done previously was systematic theology, and we took maybe a year, is that how long it was or so on that? And so now on our website or on our thing, there's a whole, you could go through all those systematic theologies, look up the subject matter, find that subject and look it up. So it's kind of fun that we have that now as like a reference thing. But my heart is, I always think of the systematic theology as a fun sort of priming the pump. Like you get to clean your coffee, you get to have the little water that cleans before, and then you get back to the apologetics stuff, because Tuesdays, that's what this originally was really for, was apologetics and worldview apologetics. And that leads to where we are today. So I'll get into that in just a second, but here's a couple things. So the end of this month, so I think January 20-something, in the 20s, the end of this month, the podcast that we've been filming will release the first thing. I don't know do we call it an episode? Is it an episode of the first? I guess that means I'm an influencer now. So I've practiced saying smash that subscribe button a couple times because that's what influencers say. But no, I'm just kidding. But that will come out. That should be coming out beginning of January. And so we've got a few more films, so that's good. Some of the subjects that we do on that, we talk about, things like reading the Bible. We did a whole episode on AI. We've done one on hell. We did a whole episode on hell, which was fun. We did one when I just put my contacts in, which I'm not wearing right now, and I couldn't see anything, and my eyes were watering, and I started getting a fever, and Brett was asking me about politics. I don't think that one went very well, but we'll see what happens. But if you want to get me at my most sassy, make sure I'm getting a fever and I can't see anything and my eyes are watering uncontrollably. But anyways, the podcast is coming out. And then the other big thing is I'm hoping to be done with this book, Mere Membership, which I'm really excited about. It's just a really good-looking book. But it's going to be great. I have one more chapter to make sure it's finished up. I've got a couple quick readers that are going to go through it. And anyone that, if you're super interested in being a part of that, let me know, and then I'm going to get it all fixed up. And so I'm hopefully maybe in February or something, we'll have that book ready. And so that'll be great. It's one of the most distinct aspects of our church ecclesiology, knowing who we are, how we function. This book will explain it really well. I think it's an important book, actually. But of course I do. I wrote it, but I really do think so. I think it'll be great. So that should be coming out hopefully in February. And then the plan is we'll go through this book and see what happens. So let me say a quick prayer, and we'll introduce ourselves. So, Lord, thank you for the privilege of getting to do these Tuesday night theologetics. Thank you for everyone here. Thank you for everyone watching at home. What a blessing. I ask that you would richly reward us for this time. You're good. It's awesome. Help us to really benefit from it. And again, thank you, Lord, for the privilege. In Jesus' name, amen. Taking a couple weeks off was good for me. I missed it. I'm glad I missed it. Had I not missed it, I just wouldn't have done it. I'm not doing this because it needs to be done. I'm doing this because I like it. So what that means is I do care about you, but I'm here because of it's fun for me as well. And so the book we're going to do, I mentioned, is called God's Undertaker by a guy named John Lennox. John Lennox, again, was really known in the apologetic sphere in the mid-2000s, okay? He's a mathematician, I believe it is, and you'd see him debate people like Richard Dawkins, the new atheists and stuff. So in one sense, I've actually taught this book before, years and years ago, right around 2000, maybe 9 or 10. And so it's been a long time. And so why choose to go back to this book? A book from 2007, a book about, evolution and science and the compatibility with science, with our own faith and understanding it. The book is really about a thing called scientism, and Lennox was ahead of his time. In fact, most of the debates during that new atheist period didn't at all cover what Lennox was covering. Lennox's whole idea wasn't debating evolution, wasn't debating intelligent design, although he does do that in the book, but his main premise is that what most people were calling science was really scientism. It was the idea of an absolutist sort of faith in science with kind of denying that those presuppositions were what they were. So why go back to that? All right, so I spent 20 years teaching you. We went through Francis Schaeffer. We went through his complete works. We've gone through so many of his works, describing the tracing of the line of despair all the way down. And the guy that followed him, obviously, we did Nancy Pearcey and Love Thy Body. We did all of that before the transgender movement came out. We were ahead of the game there. So you guys that were listening to that teaching from Nancy Pearcey and the stuff we talked about, as soon as the transgender stuff became on the scene, you guys were already ahead of it. You already understood the dynamics, the categories. You understood how to argue it. How many of you remember that experience? You were ahead of it, and you saw, okay, a few of you. We were ahead of that. Then when we got to we did Truman, and we dealt with the rise and triumph of the modern self, and that really helped us understand sort of the theology behind why things are the way they are, where it's going next, and really traced the place we get to, which is like pagan. And so my premise that I've been teaching, then I went through a bunch of other guys and a bunch of other books and how we got our world, but the basic thing I've been making the case for literally 20 years is that our natural state of culture and across the world and across history is not secularism, it's paganism. No matter what time you look. And that's why when you go all the way back to Genesis and you look at Genesis 19 and Sodom and Gomorrah and how like modern some of the arguments seem, when Lot says, hey, why would you come, don't do something so wicked? And they're like, because you judged us, we'll make it worse. You're like, whoa, you sort of see these arguments as being very ancient. And the reason for that is that like when we start to think, we've been taking for granted as Americans that we live in a country, and we covered a whole book about this, the book that made your world, covering the idea that our Western civilization has been built upon the presuppositions of the Bible. All of the West, and particularly, America, but the West in particular has been built on the biblical presuppositions. Things like the truth exists and that debate matters because there is such a thing as right and there's such a thing as wrong, and that free speech is a relevant element of not silencing opposition, but arguing against it because people actually believe there's a point to actual argument. You go through some of the other Christian presuppositions about the value of man, which have been undermined now. It's no longer a telos, and we could go on. Those presuppositions have been assaulted from every side, right? For the therapeutic culture and now ultimately in the Marxist culture, which denies all the presuppositions of the West. There's a reason you had, what do they call it, like gays for Palestine, right? I mean, you're like, how is that? How do these two movements work? Well, the thing that holds them in common is they both oppose the West. There's a reason that you can have, Marxists and Islamists in partnership right now at this very moment because both want the destruction of the West. For the Muslim, wants to build a khalifa on the rubble of Western civilization, and that goes really well hand in hand with the Marxist, whose whole goal is to truly just destroy the civilization. And so these two work hand in hand. It's ironic that the week that we just watched communist dictator fall, the newest communist socialist elected to governor in New York City just made sure that the Freedom Tower in New York is lit up green to celebrate Muslim Heritage Month. And the irony of that on the towers that were built right after where 9/11 was supposed to be are just hard to stomach at times. There's the provocativeness to all of it. I say all of this to say the point I've been making is that early modernism, when you think about modernism, think about turn of the century, 1800s, early 1900s. Modernism was the denial of the supernatural. So old school liberalism denied the supernatural. Think like David Hume and all those guys, right? No supernatural. That's all about evidence for the resurrection. This was like the Jesus movement that was trying to find the historical Jesus, divorced from all sort of miracles and whatnot. And this modernistic movement ended up becoming postmodern. Postmodern was the movement that sort of relativism. And my point all along was that postmodern isn't the end of the stop. The next stop is where we've always been, which is paganism. And that's where we are now. We live in a religious culture, just not a Christian one. And so by that, everything's religious. Every discussion is using words like values, oughts, and shoulds, but there's no more assumed middle. There's no way to communicate. I've been making that case for a long time. You should be familiar with it. Is paganism the final stop? Maybe. My argument tonight, as I start this book, is that there's always a pendulum swing. Even though we know ultimately history is linear because God has a plan, it is going somewhere, it is a lot more like fashion than you would imagine. In other words, if you're old enough to have lived through, how many of you remember skinny jeans? You guys remember skinny jeans? And how many of you were in the room when I predicted that Jenko jeans would be highly in fashion? Anyone remember that? Okay, a few of you do, the rest of you weren't paying attention. I made a big case that Janko jeans, the big baggy jeans, low-waisted big baggy jeans are coming back in style. And you're like, ha, ha, ha. They're back in style 100%. Just to mock everybody, I bought a wallet chain that I will currently bring out, and then sure enough, now that's in style. Because people think, my daughter thought, are you prophetic? How do you know the styles? And I just remember what came next. I'm like, well, if this came, then that's going to come next. And so what's coming after the 90s? You know what's coming. All right, heresy and anti-theological ideas, like the wrong theology, is also the same. Nothing is new under the sun. They're just recycled fads. And so the moment we're in, this pagan moment, has a backlash. And that backlash at this moment is not Christian revival. What I would argue is the backlash is going to be return to the desire or the idea of secularism. Old school, atheistic secularism. The problem is, as pendulums swing back, they don't swing as far. And so this swing back to the secularism, the new atheists that are no longer relevant will become relevant again, but they're going to look a lot more like Anthony Fauci than they do even Richard Dawkins. So I wrote a little paper. It's in your notes. You can take it home. You can look at it. You can disagree with it. I think it's right, but I'm out over my skis giving you my analysis, and I've had some weeks off, so forgive me. We're going to go through this. Then I'll take us through the preface if we have time, but the main thing I want you to understand is what I'm telling you tonight. So here's what I wrote. Where we are now and what comes next. The so-called new atheists did not win. They simply ran out of borrowed capital. Their moment, roughly 2004 to 2012, depended on a fiction, the myth of neutrality. Just so we know what the new atheists are, think of the God delusion, Richard Dawkins, the Sam Harris, all those guys. Anyone heard of those people? Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris. How many of you guys know who I'm talking about? Thank you. Okay, they were called the new atheists. If you were at work back in the day in the 2010, 11, 12, people, your coworker, oh, he's really smart. He's like, what has religion ever done? No. He's just like parodying the dumb ideas that would never pass like a first-year philosophy class. That was the new atheists. And we can get into it, and I'll mercilessly mock them still too. But they ran out of borrowed capital. Their moment was 2004 to 2012. That was it. You lived through skinny jeans. That's what it was. And it all depended on a fiction, the myth of neutrality. Think of this. Back during that time, we still hadn't totally graduated from the Walter Cronkite era that a newsman could tell you objective news. And we've all recognized right now that that doesn't really exist any longer. That's been shattered. But back then, neutrality was still a thing we believed in. This is all before COVID. This is all before the politicization of every single thing. It was all before the rewrite of the DSM that just changed all the definitions. It's all before the politicization of every single category. Secularism claimed to stand nowhere in particular, to adjudicate truth without worship, morality, without metaphysics, meaning, without God. But neutrality never existed. It only appeared to exist because secularism was operating inside a culture still shaped by Christian presuppositions: human dignity, moral obligation, rational order, and the assumption that truth itself matters. That's where we get all the Schaeffer stuff, right? That inheritance has now collapsed. Schaeffer was correct. We reached the bottom of the line. For a season, secularism could pretend to be self-sustaining because Christianity had already done the cultural work, right? But once those assumptions were openly rejected, accelerating after 2014 and erupting culturally around 2016, secularism was exposed for what it always was, not the absence of religion, but a rival faith living off another's foundations. Now, it's right here. It's 2016. When you think of that year, what do you think of in 2016? Anyone want to say it? I'll ask, what happened in 2016? Donald Trump got elected president of the United States of America. He was a leftist. He came in on the right. And you know who opposed him? The neutral experts that had always been on the left. And they opposed him viscerally. He represented something that they hated. Regardless of the politics, you have to understand that the expert class had been eaten from the inside by a parasite that had taken off the face of neutrality and worn it around like Hannibal Lecter's mask. They weren't neutral. They never were. And so Trump comes in, and it challenged them to remain neutral. They couldn't do it. They picked sides. Journalism became teeth. It was no longer reporting this. The news was reporting a narrative. It became obvious. 2016 accelerated that. The lines were getting sharper. And that accelerated all the way up till the blip of 2020, where those lines really solidified. And so what are we saying here? And what secularism was exposed in this moment as being not neutral. This is why the new atheists, John Lennox, what he's dealing with in his book, feel dated. Not because their arguments were devastatingly refuted, though many were, and I would say they all really were, but because the conditions that made new atheism plausible no longer exist today. A culture no longer shaped by Christian moral memory cannot sustain the illusion of secular neutrality. When you don't believe that truth exists as a thing, how do you then stand up and say this is the truth? Like we're in that space right now. Into that vacuum, what do you get? Religion. Religion has returned rapidly and unapologetically. And by religion, I don't mean Christianity. I mean paganism. Paganism has always been the religion of fallen man, and that has filled the gap. If you listen to just debates from the 90s, old school Bill Clinton debates, when they would talk about abortion and being safe, legal, and rare, and the different kinds of things they would say, even the debates themselves, the ability to try to persuade someone on the other side of things, that just got shattered. And it doesn't look like that at all anymore. Now you're hearing, the folks that believe in transgenderism, let's say, as a moral good. And so you're like, that wouldn't even be a part of the conversation, a moral good. Now instead of talking about prostitution is bad, like that is sex work, it's actually respectable. And you're like, so the same people that said The Handmaid's Tale was the goal of, let's say right-wing, politics, is the same one putting on a hijab to be thankful for the thing. You're like, without any irony at all. It's all just morality now. Every single campaign promise, every single thing from both sides is using all the language of religious language. And in the midst of that, religion itself of every stripe has been taking place because all of a sudden everyone's lost neutrality. So everyone's fighting for dominance, right? That's basically what's been happening. So this is paganism. It's emotion-driven, power-oriented, absolutist, and unforgiving. And what do we see that as? That's ultimately what I would argue has always been Marxism. It doesn't argue, it declares. It doesn't reason, it ritualizes. And what has risen since about 2015 is not secularization, but re-sacralization. What does that mean? It's making everything a religious debate. I remember when Roe v. Wade got overturned, there was a giant hubbub because Sony hadn't responded yet. What does Sony have to say about Roe v. Wade? They're like, they need to pick a side. Everyone needs to pick a side. Whoa, whoa, whoa. This is a re-sacralization. Everything was now a religious conversation, but there was no salvation. Worship was the order of the day, but with no transcendence. Law without grace, condemnation without atonement. That's the whole issue of the critical race theory, which is just the Marxism movement. It is condemnation, no atonement, just constant destruction. Alongside this, meanwhile, where you had all the sort of pluralistic kind of religious ideology happening, you had Islam, a geopolitical religion, continuing to grow and spread into a Europe that no longer had any ability to go against it. And so they didn't grow just demographically, but ideologically, offering coherence, authority, and communal meaning in a fragmented West. And across the cultural landscape, everything's become religious again. Politics, sexuality, identity, nationhood. Yet, it is religion without mercy and moral certainty without forgiveness. Ironically, even the new atheists have begun to acknowledge what has been lost. And that's what's so fun about this. Does anyone here remember me teaching John Lennox before? Let me see some hands up. Anyone? Okay, just my dad. And he had to remember. All right, you guys don't even remember it. But I do. I can't believe I can actually say I'm old enough to remember doing something at this church. That's a crazy thought. So I kind of like having coffee instead of water. Like this just seems so much more classy. Anyways, but even the new atheists today that were so confident back then, the whole argument of the new atheism was just a smug certainty that religious ideas in any form had no place. They were the ones that popularized the idea that, oh, you believe in the flying spaghetti monster? Like just stupid arguments. Those people, like to a man, every single one of them today have been eating crow. Every single one of them today are now saying, well, maybe Christianity is good. Because they recognize that we need essentially an ideological crusades, essentially. And that's what you're seeing right now. You're seeing how do we combat, how do we have a space for science in the normal way? So Richard Dawkins, the main opponent Lennox is addressing in our book, right? Whose God Delusion appeared in 2006. So Dawkins wrote the God Delusion in 2006, and Lennox responded by God's Undertaker in 2007. So do you guys all feel like you're understanding the history where we're at so far? Okay, that same Richard Dawkins that wrote the God Delusion 20 years ago has now publicly urged the West to preserve its Christian inheritance. Not because he believes it's true, mind you, but because nothing else has proven capable of sustaining the moral and cultural order it once underwrote. In other words, he's actually inadvertently making Schaeffer's argument that truth corresponds to reality. And it just so happens that Christianity seems to be the best explanation that allows us to live in a West where science can be done without all the weird, comments. So, for example, when you look at they had the medical association up on Congress, subpoenaed for some big thing, and they had to bring experts about the science of transgenderism. And the experts they brought literally had no science. Their argument was, well, it's the science. Well, what science? Well, it's the science. Well, from scientists. Which one? Well, this guy. And they bring a person out who was just a general practitioner of children's medicine who happened to also be transgender and then answered vague questions. The problem is they were wearing a lab coat. And we're like, that seems science. It's pure political. We're like, it's political theater. It's completely gone. That's why, and so what happens is we don't trust the experts anymore. That's essentially it. And for good reason, because the experts lied to us. Egregiously, and all of us know it. So you know who gets popular when all of a sudden we're not sure if the doctor is being honest? Witch doctors. And so everyone's popped up telling you which crystal will help you with which thing, and so because we all have to now figure it out, we're going back to witch doctors because no one trusts the experts because heaven forbid. We're in a little bit of a crisis, an authority crisis. We don't know if a video is real. We're going to need blockchain to make sure that video is authentic because how do you know it wasn't Trump riding a shark, right? How do you know if when Venezuelan invasion happened, we're like, was it even real? Did it even happen? I'm like, now we know it's real, but I'm like, okay. I guess my point is Dawkins and their arguments on the other side, acknowledging we need a Christian sort of heritage in the West, is profound, right? The admission is devastating. It concedes what secularism can't escape, which is that it needs Christianity so it can deny it. But in response to today's chaos, so that's so important to understand, but here's the trick. Here's the pendulum. In response to today's chaos, especially since 2020, a new temptation has emerged among Christians. The temptation to answer pagan fervor and geopolitical Islam with geopolitical Christianity. Essentially, think again, the Crusades. When you study the Crusades, it was an idea of stopping the Islamic horde coming in, and so the Catholic Church was like, well, we need to stop it. It was the state married to the church. And the argument, if you go online right this second and say, well, America needs to have a church that is not the state, but we need to have a state that is informed by morality, they'll say, no, so you think that it's going to be secularists and atheists that are going to defend us from Islam? And so essentially the argument, even though they're not trying to say it, of sort of Christian nationalism is the Crusades. And so since Catholics have a geopolitical religion and Islam has a geopolitical religion and Israel has a geopolitical religion, and well, what do Protestants do? They're like, well, we'll just believe in theonomy and we want a Christian nation. I'm like, it's false. The church is not the state. But the impulse I've been talking about is there. Why? The Crusades, right? The temptation to answer pagan fervor with geopolitical Christianity. To meet a motive absolutism with baptized power. To fight fire with fire, in other words. And my friends, here's the key. Don't miss this. This is a temporary moment. The instinct is absolutely understandable, but the strategy is absolutely fatal. Because when the cultural backlash comes, and history suggests it will, the culture will not discriminate carefully between truth, actual true claims that hold up to scrutiny, and paganism, and Islam, and politicized Christianity, and the fact that you'll have the cults, and they'll just lump it in the same category, and it's all going to be swept into the same category, and the culture will reach once more for an old refuge, secularism. Why? Because it wants authority again. This return has to make sense, not because secularism is true, but because, here it is, paganism is exhausting. The internet is exhausting. In the old days of Facebook, you'd go on and tell people about what meal you ate. And you're like, who cares? And you're like, whatever. And something viral wasn't. Now, we're doing, news stories are about tweets. And about he said this. The divide is so exhausting. And we all know it. And so we long for an expert class to tell us what's true again. We long for it culturally, right? That's kind of my argument here. Competing absolutes without mercy wear people down. Moral totalism without forgiveness produces fatigue rather than conviction. And when cultures grow weary, they do not ask what is true, they ask what will make the pressure stop. I told you this after the most recent election of Donald Trump. It was a rejection of the absolutism of the claims of the transgender and this, and all the data proves that. But I was remarking to you that at a certain point, there will be a rejection of the debate entirely. Secularism promises relief. The impulse of what I think it's going to go back to, and here's where I'm out over my skis, and I could be wrong. But the impulse of what I think we're going back to is what we got a brief glimpse of during COVID. Figures like Anthony Fauci, who said, I am the science. You can't even question me, even though his data was not there, literally. He was false. The things he said were literally untrue. He changed, he was a bad scientist. He stopped inquiry, right? In fact, we all know that he became more than an advisor. You could go downtown in San Diego during COVID if you were allowed out of your house for a moment with your mask and all your stuff, and you could buy an Anthony Fauci candle. Like, the Catholics had the candles with the saints and the icons on it. You can buy the Anthony Fauci candles. He was a cultural icon, a religious icon. For just a moment, the pagans liked that he was saying that he was their pagan guy. But here's the thing. He didn't cloak himself in religious language. He never said oughts and shoulds. He kept saying things like science says. He functioned as a moral authority, and dissent wasn't merely corrected, it was condemned. For example, if you ask questions about the extent to which climate change is something that we can affect or do, you were not called an inquisitive person. You were not even called wrong. You were called a climate denier. That's the language of heresy. If you questioned the data about COVID, which in every single question, and I am unapologetically telling you right this because the whole time I followed it very closely and I was tired of the smug assurances, why don't you trust the science? And I'm like, it's not there. Show me the data. It was incorrect. It was false. Listen, if you can be in an elevator and smell someone's fart through your mask, it passed through their blue jeans and your mask, and the fart particles are a lot bigger than COVID. The argument that we're safe now standing 6 feet apart, I'm sorry, that's a great experiment. Go in an elevator and do it, and if everyone smells it, you're like, well, that was a good experiment. We all know what's happening. Well, my quick experiment there maybe wasn't as effective as you thought. Nobody liked it. Appeals to the science operated as appeals to unquestionable truth. If you remember, our governor told us how many tennis balls we could bring to tennis ball court, how many people we could have in our homes and Thanksgiving. At one point, because of science, we were told you couldn't go to the beach because a stupid, ridiculous person wrote a stupid, ridiculous paper that wasn't peer-reviewed that said that on ocean breezes, sometimes COVID could travel further. That paper was rejected, but before it was rejected, people were getting arrested surfing or running at the beach. We lived through that. COVID revealed how quickly science can be transformed into fundamentalist secularism, complete with orthodoxy, heresy, and discipline. We quickly moved past it into the open paganism we have now, but my argument is that we're going to come back to that. That moment didn't last. Paganism soon reclaimed the cultural spotlight. And when I say paganism, think the transgender arguments. This is purely anti-science. But the exposure remains. Beneath the chaos, the culture still longs for experts who speak with confidence, institutions that promise control, and authorities that claim certainty without transcendence. At some point, it will return there again. Right now, things are polarized. Right now, you see a polarization between a Marxist left and a right that's increasingly using Christian-type language to sort of baptize their cultural power. And so now, no longer it's about what's true, right, good for the country, the economy, and what have you. The current czar for apartments by Zoran Mamdani has said that property rights and owning an apartment, owning a house, owning property is white supremacy. That's a Western ideal. That's baked in the very idea of the Declaration of Independence, that we are allowed to keep the things that you make. It's the basic premise of capitalism, and this is now completely rejected. That line is so severe. Now, my argument is the pendulum has gone back on that one. The next place, people are just sick of it. They're sick of the extremists. And so they're going to want a guy that sounds like they can talk out of both sides of their mouth with secular expertise. And so this is where the new atheists from 2007 become useful again. They speak the language of moral certainty cloaked in rationalism. We don't have any of that right now. We are so irrational. That's all we want. Let me give you an example. How many of you have heard Bill Maher in the last year speak at all? Bill Maher. Okay. 10 years ago, Bill Maher would have offended you egregiously. All of a sudden, he's really reasonable sounding. You know why? Because he doesn't think that boys are girls. And we're so overwhelmed with obvious irrationality that even a guy who doesn't think God exists, who thinks that, the old school liberal, the guy who wouldn't agree with any of his things, who would mock you mercilessly, who had a career mocking you mercilessly for so long, says something that doesn't seem so irrational. We're like, you know what, we got to platform this guy. I like him all of a sudden. That's what I'm saying. We're longing for it. Just it's like speak normal for a second. We're like, oh, I like that guy. Listen, the promise is deeply attractive to a culture desperate for quiet. And reason and rationalism is giving you a false promise that can rise above the fray, a return to enlightenment thinking, a better day, but it's an illusion. Rationalism is not neutral, and it never was. And once the veneer of Christian presuppositions is gone, and make no mistake, it is gone, rationalism doesn't become humbler. It becomes harsher. When it comes back, it will reveal itself to be just as religious, just as absolutist as anything it replaces with its own dogmas, its own heresies, and its own mechanisms of exclusion. The difference is not that it lacks faith, but that it refuses to name it. And that's why the return to secularism, I believe, will not be a return to genuine restraint or pluralism. Neutrality is no longer believable. A culture that's lived through open religious conflict at every sphere cannot pretend again that public life is faith-free. We all know it's not. So secularism, when it returns, it will return armed and not modest, confident and not cautious. It will not say, we believe nothing. It will say, we believe in science, expertise, and progress. And those beliefs will be enforced. What returns will be religious secularism. Secularism with fervor. Secularism with moral absolutism. Secularism with coercive instincts. Not inquiry, but scientism. Not persuasion, but enforcement. Not tolerance, but orthodoxy. I'll give you an example. If a scientist comes out and gives a report, and they say, what do they say? Well, all these other scientists disagree. The very fact that you think that a group of scientists somehow make truth more true than the one guy who disagrees is so anti-science, you're an idiot. The very premise of science is it doesn't matter if 1,000 people disagree. It doesn't make facts any more or less true because facts, as they say, don't care about your feelings or the feelings of the committee that just lied to us with 51 intelligence experts that told us that Hunter Biden's laptop was Russian propaganda. And so we're so used to that again. Eventually, we're going to return to a time where one scientist can talk about something true and it can make everyone else not true, although we're still going to want control. And so we're going to be in the time of the climate deniers and the rest. In other words, new atheists will be resurrected, I believe, not as edgy outsiders, but as institutional priests. And when that happens, and I believe that many signs suggest a cultural swing, if you want me to pick, I'll say sometime after 2028. The questions thought to be buried will return with force. Why do I say 2028? I think that the election, the next presidential election, the left has doubled down on the Marxist instincts that the country has rejected. And the right is, opposing them. And so I think until the left loses the next presidential election, which I hope they do, but we'll see, they're not going to rejigger. They're not going to become moderate. After Reagan won election, the left had no superstar to rely on for the next election. They lost pretty poorly, pretty badly. And so the next guy they put up was a moderate, Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton would have to be a Republican now on how far things are. In other words, we had all this moderateness in the 90s. At the same time, the new atheism were just getting steam. That's kind of what I think is happening again. In other words, our culture is not reacting to, or rather, my whole point right now, here it is. Francis Schaeffer, where am I at? I lost my place. Oh, when that happens, 2028, I said, books like God's Undertaker from 2007 will prove, I believe, newly relevant. Not because the debate's new, but because the cycle has turned. Bell bottoms came back. Francis Schaeffer exposed the loss of truth in the 60s and the 70s. Carl Trueman traced the rise of expressive selfhood in 2020. And God's Undertaker, written in 2007 at the height of new atheism, totally seeming almost irrelevant to this discussion, before the collapse of secular confidence, before the rise of pagan politics, before scientism became openly religious and authoritarian technocracy, we had a book answering the questions that they're going to be using with force. In other words, it's not reacting to where we're going, it was already answering it. The cycle doesn't end in paganism, secularism, or power. It always returns to the same question. Can a godless worldview bear the weight of its own presuppositions? Can a godless worldview sustain the world it inherits? And history keeps answering us over and over again, no. So the calling of the church, I would argue, is not to chase the cycle, not to get ahead and, we used to have shiplap on the walls. Well, now we're going to get into having whatever the new style is. It's not to chase the cycle, nor to react endlessly to its last turn, but to interrupt it. Too often, our apologetics are written behind the curve, answering questions only after the culture's already moved on, responding to yesterday's doubts while tomorrow's convictions are already hardening. And this is true. If you went to school and got any sort of education in apologetics, you learned how to really argue well against the things that people said 10 years earlier. That's the whole point. And that's my whole thing of these Tuesday nights, is I want it to be a lab where I can study a lot and hard and read stuff, and my whole goal for the last 20 years has been to try to stay one step ahead of where I think things are going, not because I'm smart, but because I can watch and see patterns. Again, normal things. And so try to get you guys equipped before the conflict happens so you know how to answer what I think is coming. The goal, I would argue, is instead of being skilled at explaining what just failed, we want to be more prepared to challenge what's about to be trusted. So returning to God's undertaker is not an exercise in nostalgia, although you're going to find it is nostalgic, but it's an attempt to get ahead of the moment by sharpening answers to the questions that inevitably return whenever secular confidence reasserts itself. In the end, listen to me carefully, the hope of the world is not found in pagan passion, secular management, or religious power. It's found in the one who stands outside the cycle altogether. The way, the only way, the truth, the only truth, the life, the only life. And our task is not to reinvent him for each cultural swing, but to speak him clearly before the swing comes. So that's what I worked on. That's why I think we should be doing God's Undertaker. Now, if you want to write a rebuttal, feel free. But I think mine's going to hold up. So I'm going to take us through, in about maybe 15, 20 minutes, the preface of the book. I'll skip around a tiny bit. Lennox is a great writer. You guys all with me now? Some head nods? You guys all, okay, let me ask you a question, because since you're here, I get some participation. How many of you, just a show of hands, how many of you think you can actually buy my argument? You think that you're going to start hearing a secular type argument being put forward? How many of you buy that now after what I said? You're convinced? Anyone want to admit that you think I'm completely off base and wrong? I'm okay with it. All right, nobody? We can fight later, it's fine, I'm not stressed. That's why I'm wearing glasses, by the way. I went to a jiu-jitsu class thinking I could wear contacts again. And in the first, 10 minutes of my first match, I got elbowed in the face, and my contact went flying out. And these are the contacts you have to stick to your eye. So I'm like, how did that even happen? So I'm back to glasses for now. That's just not enough. I can't handle that. All right, so here's the preface of the book. God's Undertaker, John Lennox. One quick aside, if you are under the age of 20, if you're under the age of 30, I'll say, this book is going to be everything. You need it. You need his arguments. They're profoundly modest and inarguable. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why in particular does the universe exist? Where did it come from, and where, if anything, is it heading? Is it itself the ultimate reality behind which there is nothing, or is there something beyond it? Can we ask with Richard Feynman, what is the meaning of it all? Or was Bertrand Russell right when he said the universe is just there, and that's all? These questions have lost nothing of their power to fire human imagination. In fact, how many movies have we just watched or seen where the multiverse is deciding who's doing what? The Dark Matter, Blake Crouch on Apple, all these books are better, but the multiverse, which is all, we'll get into it a little bit. But spurred on by the desire to climb Everest peaks of knowledge, scientists have already given us spectacular insights into the nature of the universe we inhabit. On the scale of the unimaginably large, the Hubble telescope transmits stunning images of the heavens from its orbit high above the atmosphere. On the scale of the unimaginably small, the scanning, tunneling microscope uncovers the incredibly complex molecular biology of the living world with its information-rich macromolecules and its micro-miniature protein factories, whose complexity and precision make even advanced human technologies look crude by comparison. That statement is an understatement. When Darwin wrote The Origin of Species, and he said, in the Galapagos Islands, these birds have beaks that are long and thin, and these birds have beaks that are like this. And his whole premise of survival of the fittest and natural selection were premised on sort of morphological, broad spectrum ideas that change can happen gradually, rapidly at the time. At the time when Darwin wrote The Origin of Species, they believed that the cell was a mass of goo. In other words, it was just like a bunch of Legos, so it's pretty easy to switch a few Legos. After that, molecular biology showed us that each cell is so intricately complex that the cell itself needs way more time to quote-unquote adapt. Like you can't just do it rapidly. It's more complex than a universe. It is such a huge deal, which made them say that, natural selection isn't enough time because the cell is so complex that so now we no longer think that things evolved out of some prekaryotic like goo. We actually believe that organic material came here from aliens on the back of crystals, which is the number one theory right now in evolutionary biology books at every university. It's called panspermia. There's no evolutionist comment that I can think of right now that doesn't hold to some form of this because we just don't have enough time here to account for how complex the cell is. If you're not fascinated by that, you're not going to like this book. Are we and the universe, with its profusion of galactic beauty and subtle biological complexity, nothing but the products of irrational forces acting on mindless matter and energy in an unguided way, as the so-called new atheists led by Richard Dawkins suggest? Is human life ultimately one, admittedly improbable, but nevertheless fortuitous, arrangement of atoms among many? In any case, how could we be in any sense special, since we now know that we inhabit a tiny planet orbiting a fairly undistinguished star far out in an arm of spiral galaxy containing billions of similar stars, a galaxy that's only one of billions distributed throughout the vastness of space? The new atheists were famous for saying things like, you're not special, we're just one speck in the cosmos, and you're just a dirty little planet, just like not even the best planet, and then people aren't even that awesome. And yet those same people later would come up and say, but we are stardust. And I'm like, who cares? What makes stardust better than normal dust? You just smuggled in romantic meaning to this idea. Again, I'm getting ahead of myself. I got to stop. What is more, say some, since certain basic properties of our universe, like the strength of the fundamental forces of nature and the number of observable space and time dimensions as a result of random effects operating at the origin of the universe, then surely there could well be other universes with very different structures, right? Maybe we're all actually Spider-Man after all, right? May it not be that our universe is only one in a vast array of parallel universes forever separated from each other? Is it not therefore absurd to suggest that human beings have any ultimate significance? Their measure in a multiverse would seem effectively reduced to zero. Thus, it surely would be an intellectually stultifying exercise in nostalgia to hark back to the early days of modern science, when scientists such as Bacon, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, and Clerk Maxwell, for example, believed in an intelligent creator God whose brainchild the cosmos was. Science has moved on from such primitive thinking, we're told, squeezed God into a corner, killed and then buried him by its all-embracing explanations. In other words, the secularist, the atheist, made an argument that anyone that believes in God and is a scientist really just believes in a God of the gaps. That is to say that Dawkins was famous for saying this as well, that whatever you can't explain, you just say God, and that's your explanation. But that's just because, that's the gap in what we know. But science is knowing more and more and more every day, and so your God is getting smaller, and he's shrinking, and there's no room for him. Now, first of all, that's asinine. Why? Everything we learn about science is making the gaps bigger, not smaller. It's an idiotic statement. It doesn't fit the facts, and philosophically, it's untrue. Once I discover the complexity of the engine in the car outside, it doesn't mean that Mr. Ford doesn't exist. I see the design and recognize the designer. But anyways, again, I'm getting ahead of myself. I need like a buzzer where I can shock myself back into staying on track. But that's the whole point of this book, guys. I don't want to stay on track. We're going to do this the whole time. Science has moved on from such primitive thinking, right? We said God's turned out to be no more substantial than the smile on a cosmic Cheshire cat. Unlike Schrodinger's cat, God is no ghostly superposition of dead and alive. If you want to understand Schrodinger's cat, look it up. It's fascinating. He's certainly dead. That's what they said. That's what Francis Schaeffer wrote about. What happens when we killed God? What he means by killing God is we've taken away our fear of him, our need for him. When you go to the Natural History Museum, this is history told from the point of there is no God. Everything came from nothing. Go to you via the zoo. This is history based on a narrative that we've asserted. And so in that narrative, dinosaurs became birds, and then the saber-toothed tiger became a goat, or whatever we say. Like, each thing gets crazier. You know, like the monkey came from used to be a fish. I mean, like, each thing, and you can laugh, but I remember I watched some fun videos. And the whole process of God's demise in our culture shows that any attempt to reintroduce him is likely to, quote unquote, impede the progress of science, we're told. We can now see more clearly than ever before that naturalism, the idea that material and nature, the things that you see, the empiricism is all there is, the view that nature is all there is, that there's no transcendence, reigns supreme. Naturalism is basically the new atheists were recycled from the old school modernists that say that you're just a machine, you're not really a person, there's no reason to exist, but man recognized, that's Schaeffer's argument, that we're more than a machine. What do I mean by this? Empirical science, you have your 5 senses: sight, sound, taste, touch, smell. And so it can study things in the empirical world, observable things to your senses. Naturalism, materialism, states that those 5 senses is all there is. Now, here's the point. What scientific experiment gave them that idea? What did they study to say that's all? That's an assertion. And it's an assertion that they can't live by, which was Francis Schaeffer's argument. It's a philosophical argument. There's no such thing as philosophy. In other words, they say that those 5 senses are all that there is. So then what is love, truth, justice? If there is no thing if you don't have a mind anymore, all you have is a brain, the mind is an illusion because the mind would be something. In other words, how do you get information? If I'm saying the words I'm saying, what is actually happening, materialistically speaking? My tongue is going against the roof of my mouth, and I'm pushing air out, and it vibrates and makes a sound. That sound is then received in your ears. Where's the information packet that you're getting that you hear? Materially speaking. How can you measure what you hear? You can measure the intonation, you can measure, but like, how do you get the information? You're hearing sounds, but where's the actual information in the sounds? In fact, if someone didn't know the sounds that I'm saying, they would hear me saying, you're like, oh, those are sounds as well. So is it certain sounds carry information and only certain language? ¿Cómo está usted? Some of you, that's information, but others, is that like a parable of language only some of you understand? Do you understand what I'm saying? This is called information theory. So the idea is that information exists. It didn't just download to you, that we have minds because I'm a mind telling another mind things, and it's existing because we have things called minds. It's not just, oh, you can only download it, but not you because there's only so much bandwidth. Like, it's absurd. We don't live that way. We believe in art and beauty and love and truth and marriage and justice and all these things. And here's the thing, we live as if those things are true, as if the categories are real, but materialism says, no, those are illusions. Your sense of self is an illusion. Words are an illusion, even though I have to use words to say it. But if you think I'm silly, the guy named Rosenberg, the top atheistic philosopher back in 2010, made the case in a book that words aren't real, without irony. And went on the debate stage to debate that words aren't real, using words that were very real. But if he wanted to be consistent, why didn't he just get up and say, bing, ding, dong, and sit down? That would be an actual argument. Peter Atkins, professor of chemistry. I guess my point is, the idea that I'm getting to is that science, as we know right now, as it was done, let me just give you a couple quotes because I'm getting close to the end, okay? Peter Atkins, I want to understand how the new atheists, their arrogance. So keep in mind Dawkins' quote, because again, everything I'm saying, this book is from so early, but Dawkins' quote that, hey, we need to get Christianity back in the culture is so telling. But go back to the arrogance, the hubris of some of these early quotes, okay? Peter Atkins, professor of chemistry at Oxford University. You should look at the current president at Oxford. I'll give you a kick out of that. While acknowledging the religious element in the history of the genesis of science, science had some religious in the early part, he defends his view with characteristic vigor. He says, quote, science is the system of belief founded securely on publicly shared reproducible knowledge emerged from religion. As science discarded its chrysalis to become its present butterfly, it took over the heath. There is no reason to suppose that science cannot deal with every aspect of existence. Only the religious, among whom I include not only the prejudiced, but the underinformed, hope that there is a dark corner of the physical universe or the universe of experience that science can never hope to illuminate. But science has never encountered a barrier, and the only grounds for supposing that reductionism will fail are pessimism on the part of scientists and fear in the mind of the religious. The arrogance, the man that I'm speaking of with that quote should feel humiliated today, because we now have the American Medical Association telling us that a boy is actually a girl with a straight face. And so the new atheists they're kind of sitting in the background just like, I don't really want to be a part of that debate, because all you have to ask is a boy a girl? They'll hem and haw. Well, by boy, what do you mean? I'm like, what changed, man? You're just as political, pagan, as the rest. I thought, what happened to your science going to the whole world? Like, you failed. It failed so bad. And again, that's why you're not hearing about this stuff. But when it comes back, it's going to be even more smarmy than this. At a conference at the Salk Institute for Biological Science in La Jolla, California in 2006, discussed the theme, Beyond Belief, Science, Religion, Reason, and Survival. Addressing the question whether science should do away with religion, Nobel laureate Steven Weinberg said, quote, "The world needs to wake up from the long nightmare of religion. Anything we scientists can do to weaken the hold of religion should be done, and may in fact be our greatest contribution to civilization," unquote. 2006, 2 years before Barabbas Road Church was started. I was in San Diego, going to seminary, I was surfing, I was living my life while this idiot was saying the stupidest crap. I'm sorry, it's so amazing to me that I can go back. So part of me going back to this book is to gloat. Unsurprisingly, Richard Dawkins went even further. "I'm utterly fed up," quote, "with the respect we have been brainwashed into bestowing upon religion." Are you now when you ask that Christianity be reintroduced in the West so that you don't get, kicked out by Islam? And yet, is this all really true? Their arguments. I mean, some of them are all religious people prejudiced and underinformed? I mean, aren't a lot of top scientists today who've won the Nobel Prize, who are absolutely Christians? Are they just pinning their hopes on finding a dark corner of the universe? I mean, it's so arrogant. It doesn't follow reality. Each one of their arguments is like, so you're saying this other scientist over here who got the Nobel Prize is just an idiot? It only works when you're talking to the base. It only works to an uninformed person that's like, yeah, that sounds tough. It's not real. It's not even a good argument. It's a very unscientific type of statement. It's so ironic, isn't it? I mean, all the early pioneers of science who believed in God, Kepler, for example, claimed that it was precisely because there was a creator that inspired their science to even greater heights. Why? Because if God made an ordered universe, it tells us that we don't actually orbit in a circle, but in an elliptical pattern. Why? Because the numbers aren't adding up, and there's an ordered universe. And so the presupposition that there's a God means that every effect must have a necessary cause, and that cause must make sense, because if there is a creator God who's ordered and orderly, then that effect needs to make sense down to the millimeter, to the millimeter, like the Gugameter. I'm just making that up. For them, it was the dark corners of the universe that science did illuminate that provided ample evidence, ample need for the ingenuity of God. For example, is there a solution to the mind-body problem or that rational minds, quote unquote, emerge from mindless body by undirected mindless process? Now, this is my favorite part of the whole book, and I don't even know if he does that. I don't know. I've read multiple books on this subject. The basic premise is this. Mind, I just told you, is the concept that you have a mind is an immaterial concept. A brain is something you can measure. When I did my undergrad, I got to hold real brains in my hands in one of my classes. You can measure it. You can carry it. And when there's life running through it, you can measure the electrical impulses from it, right? You have a brain. But we all assume that we have a mind. We use the word mind, except the shows that we saw, like the show Brain Games on Netflix a while ago, never use the word mind. They always use the word brain. They try to say your brain is doing this as if it's a machine. But regardless, we have a mind. So the question, the evolutionist that says that that God doesn't exist, that everything came about that from mindless matter became mind, that's the question. That they're basically saying with enough time, given enough time and enough mindless processes of things banging together, you'll now get love. They say they can't get past that. They can't make, let me say this to you another way. If you had 1,000,000 years, how many rocks would it take to make Elden Ring 5? You're like, I don't even, that's a category error. Rocks in the forest don't make Elden Ring 5, right? If I said, what if I gave you like a lot of rocks? You still don't get Elden Ring 5. What if you banged them together a lot? You need a computer to play Elden Ring 5. You're going to make the computer out of rocks? Even if you had lots of rocks, you wouldn't have Elden Ring 5. It's a category error. How do you get a material thing becoming mind? How does a rock become organic matter? How does organic matter, just by itself, undifferentiated, actually write poetry, have mind? That's the question they have to jump over, and they can't. So what they say is, there is no mind. That's an illusion. They have to say that. And guys, if you think I'm giving a false statement, like that is where new atheism ended up. The atheistic philosophers had to say mind doesn't exist because you can't go from matter to mind. You guys all following me? But what does the Bible say? Genesis 1, in the beginning, God, mind spoke matter into existence. It literally says everything began with mind. God, immaterial, transcendent, no sight, sound, smell, like immaterial, spoke matter into existence. Physics, geology, botany, biological, astronomy, all of it. He spoke it into existence. One day there was physics, planets, everything like spoke, mind made matter. And that's why we're told that the word pre-exists gravity. When Jesus says everything will fall, but my word will not fail. Which one actually corresponds to the reality we actually live in? It's actually the presupposition that mind made matter. The evolutionists just saying the opposite thing. It has nothing to do with the mechanism. It has to do with the premise. Oh boy, we're going to have fun with this book. Is naturalism demanded by science? Or is it conceivable, possibly, that naturalism is just a philosophy that's brought to science, a presupposition brought to science, an arrogant one at that? A great example, and we don't have time to get into it, but Aristotle. He's reputed to have said that in order for us to succeed, we have to ask the right questions, right? But there's some questions that are risky to ask and more risky to attempt to answer. Science isn't just open inquiry into anything. Try getting a grant during COVID to study, vaccine issues. No one's like, they're going to stay away from you for a 10-foot pole. Like, grant writing, grants for studies is like politics. You better know which studies are the right studies because that's where the funding's coming from. Asking the right questions is important, but in a politicized scientific world, asking the right questions is often impossible. The whole story of Galileo wasn't that he had to reject religion, it's that he had to reject Aristotle. The presupposition that Aristotle had was the problem, not the Bible, not his faith in God. That's kind of my point. If we go a little further, let me just get to the end of this here. Scientists have a clear stake in truth. That's the key. No matter what happens, if someone says they're a scientist, they are someone that's studying, they believe truth exists. Unless you're in the multiverse. In which case, what's true now, Schrodinger's cat, the cat is alive and dead at the same time until you observe it, which changes it, which is absurd. But in reality, if you do science, it's because you believe that there's things to discover. It's because you believe that when you see something and you recognize it as an effect, you want to know the underlying cause. You want to take things apart. You want to understand what's going on. You want to marvel at things. You have to ask yourself, which presupposition makes you even want to do that? Chinese Buddhism doesn't lead to building rockets to space. Why is the tree there? It just is. Shut up. Om. But when you all of a sudden realize that God made everything and that the heavens declare the glory of God, and so does the microscope. Oh, that's awesome. But that's why we bother to do science. Okay, but Matt, what about bias? No one can escape it. And we've learned more, literally, prophetically, we're like future travelers looking back on this, being like, that's quaint. Of course there's bias, there's nothing else. No one escapes it. We're all biased in the sense that we all have a worldview that consists of our answer. When he wrote this is why I'm going through this right now. When I taught this, and I said that everyone has a worldview, everyone has a bias, I taught this, there's lots of atheists in the room, and everyone's like, huh. They couldn't even buy it at first. My bias is objective truth, obviously. That was radical. We all know that people have a bias. Everyone has a narrative. So, okay, well, how do you do science in that? Well, the question is not really that you can't do science. Science is data. It is philosophy, our worldview, that is the queen of the sciences, as we're told. Philosophy is how you interpret data. Your bias, in other words, you choose to have. It is not scientific. It is something you presuppose. You come to the table, you come to the microscope with your presuppositions. The question is, when you study the data, which presupposition explains it best? Often you'll find that the same data leads to two presuppositions. For example, I don't have time. I'm running out of time at this very second, but I got to tell you this last one. Supernovas in space. One article says that the amount of supernovas we have because an exploding star has to be so many miles away, so this proves that the universe is unimaginably old. Another article came out, also peer-reviewed, that the supernovas in space prove that the universe is unimaginably young. Same data set. Their argument was if the stars are as old as they say, there'd be 1 million trillion exploding stars in the sky, but instead we only see a few, which speaks to a very young universe. Huh. Yeah, but light had to travel here. I'm like, Genesis doesn't say that God said, let there be light, and it started traveling. He said he actually made a mature Adam and Eve, but that would answer. But anyways, the point is not the data. I trust the data. To say what? The point is not the data. The point is the way we're going to interpret it, our presuppositions. And the question we have to ask is, which presuppositions do a better job explaining real data? And Lennox's point is that science and religion, science and Christianity go together so well because these presuppositions make the best sense of actual data because this is real life. So I think we're going to have fun with the book. I hope you get excited. Fill this place up. Bring your skeptical friends. Bring people that hate what I'm saying. I don't care. I love it. Let me pray. God, thank you so much for Lennox and this book. Thank you so much for letting us be alive 20 years after this book and Dawkins and the rest were writing. With all of us get to sit as like future travelers to look back on the arrogance and hubris, but help us be humble ourselves, knowing that I think it's coming back. Help us learn the arguments, be ready for the arguments as they come, be prepared for the nuance. Lord, I pray that you would help us to be light in a dark place. Help us be prepared to answer the questions people are asking so we can lead them, get them willing to entertain the gospel of Jesus Christ. Help us to be able to win an opportunity to tell the truth about you. And I pray that you would use this teaching to help us do it. Praise you in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, we'll see you next week.